In 1921, a quiet, sickly teacher slipped into a coma and didn't wake up for an entire year. When Paul Dienach finally opened his eyes in 1922, he swore something impossible had happened. He said his mind had been ripped from his own body and dropped into another man's, nearly 2,000 years in the future. He described flying cars soaring through the sky and technology beyond anything imaginable, and of an horrific future event that would change the course of civilization. Then, just as suddenly as it began, he was pulled back to 1922. Paul Amadeus Dienach was a quiet, scholarly man, reserved, thoughtful, but physically frail. Paul was born sometime in the late 19th century and worked as a teacher. Paul later moved to Greece for health reasons, as many Europeans did at the time in search of a milder climate. By 1921, his health had deteriorated badly. Accounts differ on the exact illness, where some say tuberculosis, others encephalitis. Due to his severe physical condition, Paul fell into a deep coma and remained in the state for roughly a year. Paul was now a man suspended between life and death and unresponsive, with little expectation of recovery. But for Paul, his year trapped in a coma would be anything but a wasted and empty life. When he regained consciousness in 1922, he was reportedly disoriented, as would have been expected. But it was not just in the ordinary sense of someone emerging from a coma, but profoundly so. He claimed that his awareness had not simply gone blank during his illness. Instead, he insisted that his consciousness had somehow been transferred into the body of another person, living in a completely different era. According to his account, he awoke not in 1922, but in the year 3906 AD. At first, he did not understand what had happened. He found himself inhabiting the body of a man identified as Andrew or Andreas Northam. This man, he learned, had recently suffered an accident that left him unconscious. When Northam awoke, it was not his own consciousness that returned, but Dienach's. The people around him, friends, doctors and caretakers, were puzzled by his strange behaviour. Paul, now occupying Northam's body, could not understand their language at first, nor their customs or surroundings. He was, in effect, a man displaced in time, struggling to make sense of an alien world. Gradually, people started to realise that something was not quite right, but rather than believing it some sort of mental illness, they came to the realisation that he was acting like another person altogether, and that his personality had been replaced by another, or what could be called consciousness displacement. Over a 1-year period, Dienach was to learn that he was now living in the future, and the year was 3906. The people around him taught him about their history and their society. They also taught him about the long path humanity had had to endure to where they are now. Dienach felt like a history student, absorbing a lot of information in an effort to piece everything together, as there had been thousands of years between his time and theirs. He had learned about the amazing difference over time between the 20th century and where he was now existing way into the future. He learned that there had been a turbulent period that had spanned the 21st to 28th centuries. This particular period of time was marked by severe global crises, wars and social upheaval, environmental degradation, along with overpopulation and resource strain. During this time in history, humanity was struggling under the weight of its own technological and political systems. Nations had become unstable and gave way to more broader forms of governance, where at some point in the 27th or 28th century, there'd been a major transformation and a catastrophic period that forced humanity to fundamentally reorganize and reevaluate itself. Out of this chaos, a new global order was born. When Dienach found himself in the year 3906, he found that the world had changed beyond anything he recognized, when nation-states, in the traditional sense, no longer existed and had been replaced by a new kind of global system that was much less centralized than a single world government, but was much more unified than the fragmented political landscape of the 20th century. In society, competition had been replaced and more emphasis was placed on cooperation. The people that he encountered in the year 3906 said that their civilization had moved beyond many of the conflicts that had defined most societies of past eras, such as wars, economic inequality, and ideological divisions. Work too had changed. Most of what Dienach would have recognized as labor had been replaced and in many cases transformed by advanced technology, where people were now able to pursue intellectual, artistic, and philosophical activities rather than survival-driven employment. Dienach's descriptions of technology were a mixture of the imaginative and not only the familiar that resembled old science fiction films, but also ideas that our current society had speculated about, such an advanced transportation system, including airborne vehicles, which today is a distinct possibility, and highly developed communication technologies, similar to holographic projection. Holographic projection is the technology that creates three-dimensional, free-floating images called holograms that can be viewed from multiple angles without special glasses and sophisticated medical knowledge, and energy systems that are clean and abundant. But what stood out is the technology was not the central focus of his future society, unlike many futuristic visions that emphasized machines, but Dienach's account placed most importance on human development, intellectual, ethical, and spiritual, and that the people in the year 3906 were less concerned with material accumulation and more concerned with understanding existence itself. It is interesting to note that the most unusual part of his narrative was his emphasis on the evolution of human consciousness, where humanity in the distant future had undergone a kind of internal transformation. People were more self-aware, more reflective, and less driven by fear or ego. Education was not merely about acquiring knowledge, but about cultivating insight and wisdom, and that communication itself had changed and had become more direct and less reliant on language, and in the process had incorporated forms of intuition, empathy, and understanding. The interpretation of this future world was not just science fiction, but an emphasis on philosophical and also spiritual text. But there was a description of the future that humans throughout history would relate to, and that is an expansion beyond this planet. Dienach said that humanity had expanded beyond Earth, where Mars in particular is mentioned as a site of colonization, and this expansion was not necessarily depicted as a race for resources, but as a natural extension of human development. Space travel had become routine, and the boundaries of human civilization extended into the solar system. However, in keeping with the positive development of future humans, the emphasis was not on conquest, but on exploration and coexistence. After experiencing a year in this future world, his time there came to an abrupt end, when the man whose body he had inhabited, Andreas Northam, suddenly recovered, and at that moment, Dienach's consciousness was immediately returned to his own body in 1922, where he emerged from his long coma. For Dienach, the transition was sudden and disorienting. One moment he was in the year 3906, fully immersed and involved in that reality, and the next he was back in his own time, weak, ill, and surrounded by people who had no idea what he believed he had experienced. Being in a coma for 1 week is a shock to the mind and body, but being in a coma for 1 week would have been an extremely painful and slow recovery. However, after his recovery, Dienach began to write about what he'd experienced in a detailed diary, where he attempted to capture everything he'd learned about in the future. But he had not intended for his story to be published, but rather a personal document, record, and part reflection. In the late 1920s, Dienach's health started to decline, and he handed over his manuscript to one of his students, a young man named Georgios Papachatsis. Dienach reportedly died not long after, in the late 1920s. For many decades, his manuscript remained largely unknown, and Georgios Papachatsis had gone on to become a respected academic. Papachasis came to believe that the document was of great importance, and in 1972, many years after Dienach's death, he arranged for his manuscript to be published under the titles Chronicles From The Future. From there, the story began to circulate, particularly amongst people who were interested in the paranormal, time travel and alternative history. Paul Amadeus Dienach's account of what he'd experienced sits in a strange space between genres, where on one hand it could be read as science fiction, a man's speculative narrative about the future, written in the early 20th century. On the other hand, it presents itself as a first-person testimony of a genuine lived experience, and not a work of imagination. However, skeptics had many questions, such as the lack of independent historical records confirming Dienach's life and coma, the late publication of the manuscript, and the resemblance of some ideas to exist in speculative fiction of the time, which suggests that the experience could have been a vivid, structured dream during a coma, along with a post-recovery construction of memory, or possibly a literary creation later presented as fact. Despite the criticisms, the story continued to attract attention because part of its appeal lies in its tone. Unlike many futuristic visions, it is neither dystopian nor triumphalist, where instead it presented a long, difficult journey for humanity, but one that ultimately led to a more thoughtful and balanced civilization. However, his experience has us asking many questions such as, what happens to consciousness during extreme states? And could the mind construct entire worlds with internal coherence? And could awareness somehow extend beyond the limits we assume? So, is the story of Paul Amadeus Dienach credible? Because it not only described a moment of strangeness, but laid out an entire arc of human history, from crisis to transformation. At its basis, it is less about predicting the future than about reflecting on the present. The world of 3906, as Dienach described it, is shaped by the consequences of human choices, both destructive and constructive. And even if one rejects its premise, it still functions as a kind of thought experiment, a vision of what humanity might become, if it survives its own violent path through the ages to eventually become compassionate and civilized.